Welcome to our first speaker series of the new year. Those of you who have been to the speaker series know that we usually have one speaker, but because of the nature of the debate that we're going to talk about tonight, we have two speakers. So we'll have more of a conversation than a presentation. We're joined by UCLA professors Glen MacDonald and Jon Christensen, who recently found themselves at the center of a debate over the importance of and relevance of the legacy of John Muir. Muir is largely seen as the patron saint of environmentalism. He became famous for saving Yosemite and influencing countless preservation movements across the US. However, it's 100 years since his death and times have changed. So the question becomes, is his legacy still relevant? Before I turn it over to both Glen and Jon, let me tell you a little bit about them. Glen MacDonald is the John Muir Memorial Chair of Geography and a UCLA Distinguished Professor. He is a former UC Presidential Chair and former Director of the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. His research focuses on climate change, its causes, and its impact on the environment and society. Jon Christensen is an adjunct assistant professor in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, Department of History, and the Center for Digital Humanities at UCLA. He is currently finishing a book titled Critical Habitat, A History of Thinking with Things in Nature. He is engaged in a multidisciplinary digital environmental humanities research project on nature in cities, as well as a large collaborative project to crowdsource a new public environmental history of the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
So I'm going to turn it over to Glen and Jon and have them give you a presentation before we get into the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Claire and I want to thank the Manzanita Institute and School for inviting us here. It really is a pleasure, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm not sure we're going to duke it out too much, but I think that we hope to stimulate some thinking, and critical thinking, and good thinking, and discussion and debate. So welcome, and let's do that. I want to say a few things about Muir, the context, what's happened in the 100 years since he passed away, and what I think are some valid criticisms, and what are the things we should still bring forward from his legacy that can serve us well in the 21st century. Now, for those of you who didn't know, John Muir died in Los Angeles. He died in Los Angeles Christmas Eve in 1914. He was visiting his daughter here. And when he died, he was working on a manuscript about Alaska. We in California associate him very much with the Sierras, but he was really fascinated by Alaska and went there on a number of occasions. Now the question is, 100 years after John Muir died, we have a lot of schools named after him, parks and things like that. We've probably read snippets. Maybe some of us have read My First Summer in the Sierra. He is a prodigious writer. Probably no one here has read everything that he wrote. But he has a deep impact on us, whether we quoting him or we're just thinking about ideas that he put forward and that then became how Americans define nature and how we define conservation and how we go about doing it. But a lot has changed, and let's just look at that a little bit to understand what a different world we're in. When Muir was writing, there were about 3 million people in California. Now, it was the most populous of the western states, of course, but imagine that. That's less than a tenth of the number of people in the state today. And by 2050, we're anticipating there'll be some 50 million people in the state. The pressures on these wildland environments that he so treasured, these environments that were, not untrammeled, but were unchanged by human activity, is immense. And whether he could have imagined a state that would have had an order of magnitude more people in it, I'm not really sure. When we look at then the places that he thought was sacred in a sense, Yosemite, of course, immediately comes to mind. Now, it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s till the visitorship to Yosemite rose to the millions of people. It certainly wasn't anything like that in Muir's day. And it reached a peak of over 4 million people in the 1990s, and then actually has descended a bit. And for various reasons, But we're still seeing close to 4 million visitors a year, and much of that concentrated in the Yosemite Valley. This is just a picture of tourism at Muir's time. Remember, Muir initially made a living as a guide there, as a naturalist guiding tourists there. This was part and parcel of how he kept body and soul together. Now, as a scientist, Muir is an interesting fellow. He is known both in botany and in geology. And of course, he's known for having won the debate against Whitney, who was the state geologist, about the glacial origins of the Yosemite Valley. He's also famous for finding the first living glacier in the Sierra Nevada. And the fact of the matter is that glacier has disappeared now. And the glaciers in the Sierra Nevada, due to climate change, we were predicting somewhere between 5 degrees Fahrenheit winter warming and 7 degrees Fahrenheit summer warming. Those glaciers are disappearing. When they will all disappear, it's uncertain. But there is the potential that every single glacier in the Sierra Nevada will disappear. And the Black Mountain Glacier, the one that Muir discovered, is already gone. As climate is warming in the 21st century, and again, this is something Muir could not have anticipated, the life zones, the vegetation that he treasured, the high alpine vegetation, potentially will be replaced by forested vegetation. Lower elevation forests will potentially be replaced by other vegetation types, and there will be a huge change in the Sierra Nevada. The environment itself in the Sierra is changing. The giant sequoia groves, which Muir so treasured, and he wrote and published scientific articles about how they came to their distribution, which he felt was a relic of glaciation. We now believe that they are very, very tightly controlled by climate and by the level of the inversion layer over the Central Valley. As that changes, the life zone that they live in may disappear, and also they are very susceptible to pathogens under warm temperatures. Muir planted one in his home in Martinez. They're trying to clone that now because it can't survive under warm temperatures. So vegetation he loved could disappear. But there's more profound things happening than that in terms of our capacity to cope with preservation and conservation of the environment, with climate change, with the challenges that we face. And that is our fiscal capacity. Muir was a great believer in the role of the federal government for preserving the nature he treasured so much, hence his push to the Park Service. And yet, when you look at Muir's time, 1914, our federal debt stood at about 4% of the gross domestic product. Today, it's at 70% of the gross domestic product. The appetite, and some could argue the capacity of the government, whether at the state or the federal level, for big projects, for big initiatives, to face the big challenges that climate change is putting on environment, may have passed. It's certainly a very different world. You have members of the Congress calling for the sale of some national parklands and things like that, questioning whether the federal government should own any parklands. And you have just stark economic facts that our debt ratio is so much higher than it was in Muir's time. Muir could also be said to be the author of some of the difficulties we're facing in conservation in California, particularly in the Sierra Nevada. He, on one level, understood that native peoples had been robbed of their lands, and at a sort of a theoretical level understood that. But in his writings, particularly for California Indians, he's not particularly complimentary. And he certainly didn't pay much attention to their role in ecosystems in terms of fire and set fires and keeping Yosemite Valley clear of vegetation that provided the meadows and things like that, which provided these fantastic views. What we're seeing then is he and Gordon Pinchot put into place the Smoky Bear idea, keep fire out. That has led then to a buildup of fuel, buildup of pathogens, and really severe challenges to the forests of the Sierra Nevada that he loved so much. Now that Smokey the Bear philosophy has been put aside, but the cost of forest thinning is just unbelievably high. And so we will have these large, huge fires, which Muir would have been abhorred by. But in a sense, he was partially the author for the forest management programs we had in the 20th century. Muir also, he had a very dissected view of the state, or of the sort of land surface, in which there were farmlands, there was agricultural fields, areas where you had resource extraction of one sort or the other. Typically thought, and this is his farm, his ranch in Martinez. Then there were wildland areas, the Sierra Nevada, where you went to get away from all of that. And then there were the cities. Now, he didn't really write glowingly about cities, but he spent much of his life living in San Francisco. But we still carry that with us, and maybe Jon will speak more about that. We don't see nature all around us, and we maybe don't feel we're part of nature, because nature for Muir was a place you went to and discovered elsewhere. Now, this may be that the town that he was born in and grew up until he was 11 in Scotland was a rather bleak place, and surrounded mainly by barley fields and things like that. The city of Los Angeles and San Francisco, perhaps in the early 20th century, maybe weren't that compelling. But if you go back and look at late 19th century, early 20th century Los Angeles or San Francisco, there was green space, there was nature there, but he never really celebrates it. And yet this is a way to connect people with the environment, with nature. It's interesting to read Muir and look for his comments on the Californinos, Mexican Americans, people of Hispanic or Latino background in California. It's pretty much absent. Pretty much doesn't see it. His audience and what he sees are typically white, Anglo-European Californians and Americans and Europeans. And his choir that he preached to were powerful. And they were the powerful, politically powerful and economically powerful, and they were principally white. And you only see glimpses. He talks about Los Angeles at one point and says, where you see adobes, cheek and jowl with clapboard houses. He doesn't talk about the people living there, and you wonder what he thought or made of that. But the fact of the matter is, the demography of the nation is changing. And organizations such as the Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, reflect in general a white demographic and an older demographic. National park visitation reflects that. A 2009 study shows that 78% of the visitors to the nation's national parks were white. This is a time when 64% of the population were white. African American Hispanics are greatly underrepresented. The figures are almost exactly the same for California, despite the fact we even have a larger Hispanic population than the rest of the nation. About 77% of park visitorship is white. What's even more troubling is a survey was done about attitudes towards National Park Service, and by 2 to 3 times as much, people of color, Hispanic, African American people, felt uncomfortable with National Park Service facilities and structure, whereas it was just a minuscule percentage that felt that way amongst Anglos. That's very interesting and something we have to confront. The demography of the nation is changing. We know the demography of the state is changing. We will be a plurality and a majority Hispanic as we move through this century. Why the disconnect then from parks? And please don't say it's because these people don't care about conservation. They don't care about environment. Polls show Hispanics, Latinos have a much stronger commitment to environmental issues than average Anglo-American. So we really have some work to do there. And there's a whole group of people Muir just didn't seem to see and probably don't feel that he's speaking to them, unfortunately. Muir also wrote a lot about being alone out in nature, being out there, you're on your own. You're like the typical backpacker doing the Pacific Crest Trail by yourself. And later on we can discuss why I think he did that. But the fact of the matter is, lots of groups, nature is a shared experience. And it's a place that you want to do things with your family, with your friends. And the model that you have to go conquer it alone, far away from everything else, that may be not that good. And if you look at numbers of backcountry backpackers and things like Yosemite, you see that it's small, or overnight visitors in Yosemite. You see that it's small. There are other ways to enjoy nature besides being the sole lonely person there. Now, we can look at some things he did do, though, and you can't dispute this. National Park Service, as we know it, comes into existence in 1916. Of course, Yosemite was made a national park by his push. He wrote a great book on the national parks. He really was instrumental, amongst other people, in getting that put up. In California, we have over 7 million acres of National Park Service land we can thank Muir for. Even Pinchot's U.S. Forest Service has put a great deal of land aside now as wilderness areas. That's an indisputable legacy. When you actually get into Muir a little bit more, you see that he did lots of group activities. There was a lot of group hikes, there were local group hikes, there were lots of things with the whole family and everybody else out into nature. I think we should celebrate that. He also was all about accessibility. When there was a debate about allowing cars into Yosemite, he came down on the side of let people come and enjoy nature. And so he wasn't exclusionary. Similarly on immigration, he wrote that the state, the country should be open to everyone, and that there should be space for everybody here. And Sierra Club has had an interesting history on that topic. He also understood the power of art in terms of changing people's views on nature. This is a picture from William Keith, a fellow Scot and his great friend. Carlton Watkins photographs of Yosemite. He understood, in a sense, the multimedia and the importance of emotion and reaching out to people. He also understood that, as much as we say he was this rigid preservationist and all of that, he understood that you had to make allies in the private sector and with political sector and things like that. In some ways, he probably leans a bit more towards Peter Kariva of the Nature Conservancy than people would like to admit. But he really knew how to cajole and to play the angles on that. Now, we say then that he failed in his great fight the year before he died. Anyone know who this is? No, you don't. Good. William O'Shaughnessy. William O'Shaughnessy is the one who beat, in a sense, Muir for the O'Shaughnessy Dam and the damming of the Hetch Hetchy Valley. This is William O'Shaughnessy showing a map, and it says San Francisco, X number acres of water for the city of the Hetch Hetchy Valley. No one knows who O'Shaughnessy is anymore. Everybody knows who Muir is. He lost that battle, but in a sense, by showing us how to create an NGO like the Sierra Club, by showing us how to lobby and how to fight and how to try to stir up public reaction, even though he lost Hetch Hetchy, it's been argued that that was the model then for 20th century conservation and environmental activism. And that is a model that's not just in the United States, but it's worldwide. This is a recent rally in Australia about protecting wilderness areas in Tasmania. And in a sense, I think that is part of Muir's legacy. I'm going to turn it over to Jon. We think of him as this crotchety, rigid old man. And he certainly had his faults. I'm not trying to cover that up. But I would think we should think about what we need to take forward in the 21st century. Think about Muir as a young man who at 33 years old was sought out by 68, 69-year-old Ralph Waldo Emerson to show him around Yosemite. A young man who could admire both Asa Gray, evolutionary biologist, great friend with Darwin, and Louis Agassiz, geologist, father of the glacial theory, but a huge critic of evolutionary theory. And then in that trinity, put in Ralph Waldo Emerson, of course, who probably thought both of those kinds of arguments were immaterial compared to the spiritual state of man. I think that if we take that open mind of how we define nature, how we look at nature, and that same open mind is how we look at Muir and his legacies, it will serve us well going forward.
Leave that up.
What's that?
Leave that picture up.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess I could say I think the debate is over and I won. He's come so far over to what I've been arguing and presented it so well that it took many of my arguments right out of my mouth. But I am going to take my debate time and try to use it well. I think Glen is doing a marvelous job of rehabilitating Jon Muir, showing in new ways how we might think about him in ways that make him relevant. When I argued, when we met with a reporter from the LA Times and had a kind of debate around a table in Glen's office, and I argued that Muir is no longer relevant. And the reporter quoted me on that accurately. And then I went on to say, in words that afterwards I might have thought about rephrasing differently because they really did upset people. And I understood that, and I felt bad about that, and apologized publicly for that. Because it was hurtful. When I said after 100 years it's time to bury his legacy and move on, I was quoted accurately, but I think it was maybe it was an intemperate thing to say, I was to a certain extent playing the devil's advocate. In a debate, and it's something that we do all the time in academia, and it's one of the great things about school, classrooms, whether it's the classrooms in your school or the classrooms in a graduate seminar in the university, where you can test out ideas in a safe space, where you can say things that you might not, you're still trying to work your way towards ideas, that you can say things that you might not fully feel confident about, but you can debate them. Or you can take a really strongly held position and argue it. We can have an argument, and it can be, really intense argument about Jon Muir and his legacy and whether it's relevant anymore. And we can disagree strongly, and then we can, walk out and, go have a meal or a drink together and be friends and colleagues, and, and continue on. And that's a really valuable part of the academic and educational culture that we don't really we don't have in much of the rest of our society, and particularly not online, in the comment sections, where I was, I think I can say these things, that where I was called a giant douchebag on Reddit, a jackass on Twitter. And then a guy called me on my phone that day and said, see, he and some of his friends had been talking, and he just wanted me to know, it sounded like an elderly gentleman, he said that they were not going to let me destroy the planet. I was like, okay, good, I'm glad, But, you can, I came, I knew this, but I don't think I had fully realized, that, as Glen said, there's a reason why we say there are places that are sacred, like Yosemite, or that Jon Muir is the patron saint of environmentalism. And when you question those things that have that kind of sacredness to them, be careful. What I want to talk with you a little bit about, and here I want to get get a little bit academic, but I think it's something that's really important, and it's not it's not that abstruse. I want to talk about the difference between heritage and history, and in a way in which heritage is also connected to how we think about legacy. So heritage and heritage institutions, often like local community museums or cultural centers or genealogical societies, and much of what we see around us often as a kind of public history is really about heritage. And that's the way in which we as communities or groups or societies, the state, California, environmentalists, tell stories about ourselves and our history that make us feel good, that empower us to feel proud about our heritage, where we come from, where we're going. And that's what we as historians think of as heritage, which is very different from history. History is, the way that we think about history is a discipline. And history, we sometimes say, is argument without end. It's always unfinished. There are always questions, new questions that we're asking about history, about the sources, about the context of someone like Jon Muir. New information comes to light. We understand him in different ways. And history is complicated. And Glen did a good job, I think, of complicating Jon Muir and his history for you. He showed a lot of those complications of the man. Jon Muir was a complicated man. He was not only a wilderness and nature advocate for parks. He was a rancher and an orchardist in Martinez. He ran a big agribusiness. He became, by marrying into a family that had a big ranch and orchard in Martinez, a wealthy man. He hung out with wealthy people. He was friends of the industrialists and the railroad barons of his time. He convinced the railroad to build a station, a stop, on his ranch so that he could get goods to market more efficiently. This is part of the complicated history of the history of the man, and I think it's an important one to understand. And although some people accuse me of many things, one of which they accuse me of was wanting to forget that history. I'm a historian. Far be it from me to want to forget that history. I actually want to understand that complicated history, and I think Glen's done a good job of showing it. What I was arguing, and what I would still argue, is that while history is complicated, heritage is often very, very simple, and often, sometimes anyway, counterproductive for understanding the complications of our history and, more importantly, our times. I think the heritage or the legacy of Jon Muir that I find counterproductive, and Glen has alluded to many of these things, is that the California that we set up, the California that Muir set up, is one of the cities where it's a tripartite California. It's one where people live in the cities. He wasn't, this is the work, the vision that's sort of set out in Jon Muir's public writings, really. So that, the cities that he wasn't very fond of, where people lived, the economically productive landscape of farms and ranches and mines, and then the cathedrals of nature. And, we still live in that California, really. but it's changing. And I don't think that the way that that's set up as these kind of zones of California, divided, into these zones of California, is very helpful for understanding our relationship with nature. We're increasingly seeing, of course, that there's nature across that spectrum. There's nature in the cities and the ways that we depend on clean water, clean air, that is provided by nature, the parks and the biodiversity that we're increasingly discovering, understanding in Los Angeles, that the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles is very involved in studying and helping to connect people to. And I've come from Northern California, and I've only been here 2 years, but it always amazes me to come up to Topanga Canyon. And not tonight when it took a little bit longer, but it's only what, half an hour away, I mean, at most. And just to see the way in which even in Los Angeles we think of, the city is all imbricated with nature throughout it. We see the way in which nature is such an important part of farms and ranches, the ecosystem services, as we call them, that pollinators and others, provide to other aspects of nature, provide to making the food that we depend on. And then we also see that there's culture that runs across that spectrum too, that the wilderness, the parks, even wilderness itself is a human creation. It's a cultural creation. People created the laws that protected and still protect and administer and manage those areas. And so there's an important part of culture that runs across that spectrum too. And I don't think that Muir's way of thinking helps us really understand that in ways that help us today. The other, very fundamental, I think, kind of heritage and legacy of Jon Muir is this separation of people and nature. I think it's, similarly, we're really thinking about that in different ways. And as Glen said, this model of, the lone guy in the wilderness, with a crust of bread, in his pocket, climbing a tree in a windstorm and exulting in the power of nature. It's a wonderful image, but it's not the only way to relate to nature. I want to just show you something, a couple of things. I think it's time for a new vision for parks and nature. And so I kind of want to run through, this is some things that I work on, and it's part of what motivates me to argue that I think we should, there are new ways of thinking that Muir doesn't really help us much with. This is a picture of all of the Instagram photos taken in parks around Los Angeles last year, and it's a heat map. So the red areas are where there are more Instagram photos created. And the way that we created this visualization and harvested them was we actually took the photos that have the geographic location on them, the latitude and longitude, and then mapped them. And it's a part of a project that we've been doing on parks, where my colleagues at Stamen Design in San Francisco, we worked together on this research project, looking at all the social media that emanates from parks: Instagram, Flickr, Twitter, and Foursquare check-ins. And we ranked the parks by their sort of popularity on social media. And and then we displayed that on this website. And what we discovered is that you showed that in some ways, I mean, Muir also had this, but in contrast to, the image of the lone guy in the wilderness, parks are social. People do all kinds of things in parks that they do in the rest of their lives. They, they take selfies, they share them, they take pictures of their friends, they take pictures of their landscape, they comment on it, and sometimes they share too much information, particularly on Twitter. We found that parks are social, and that's a really powerful thing to think about. As we think about the need to create and to engage new constituencies in parks, if parks are social, we don't have to gin that up. We don't have to create that. It's already there. It's already happening. And I told this story to a deputy director of the National Park Service when I was back in Washington, D.C. in the fall, and she said, yeah, it's like these people are having a party over here, and they're talking about us, and we're not going to the party. So the parks, as Glenn pointed out, are still trapped in this old way of thinking, although they know there's this new conversation and this new party going on. And so they need to figure out how to be part of it. Because parks, the National Park Service, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary next year, state parks in California, conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and others, they look at these demographics and they realize that they're in danger of losing a whole generation of people. And those are, your students and my students in college now. And if they don't have that, if that generation doesn't come up as people engaged and supportive of parks and of conservation, we're really in big trouble. But this shows that in many ways they are engaged. They're talking, they're participating. So how do we participate in that? The other thing that this shows is one of the barriers that the Parks Forward Commission in California has identified to people diverse Californians going to parks, is that they don't think that they will see people like themselves in parks. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, it's less likely they will than in the rest of the population, but I also think that's a legacy of Jon Muir. That's a legacy of the idea of the way that you go to nature and parks, and people have told me this, is like, why are you doing this stuff about social media? You're supposed to leave that stuff behind. You're supposed to go alone into nature. That's the way to do it. It's one way to do it. It's not the only way. And what social media shows is that diverse Californians will see people like themselves in parks, and if you can show that, it's an invitation. The other aspect of this, we're the Yosemite. There's some of the Twitter. We've worked with our colleagues in groups like Outdoor Afro, which is trying to change that image, and Latino Outdoors, and what we also know about this new generation is that, and this comes from something that John Jarvis, the head of the National Park Service, once said in a hearing here in California of the Parks Forward Commission that is looking at how to reinvigorate state parks. He said they found that this new millennial generation that they're really concerned about losing, that they don't like to be spoon-fed information. They like to discover things. Their way of learning and engaging is discovery, and I think that resonates with some of the work that you're doing at the school, and your approach there. And John Jarvis said, and we've been spoon-feeding people information for 100 years. So it's really hard for us to change this. And I think it's part of this legacy of Jon Muir, that there's this one sacred way of relating to nature. And if people don't do it that way, it must be because they they don't care or something. And I think if we ask people whether they care, whether they have a relationship with nature, we will find that all people do. And that the thing that we need to do now is to ask the question and listen. So we're working to develop an app that is going to launch. You're among some of the first people publicly to hear about it in a couple of weeks, called caliparks.org, which will be a way to discover parks near where you are or where you're going to be today, where you can do things that's based on the user experience and the user discovery of that. That's going to be part of a bigger effort to build a constituency and engagement in the future among this very diverse, millennial, technologically savvy, socially engaged generation for parks. And I would just leave you with, because I also like to think not just about our own backyard in California, but about the global significance of it. This is a map of the world of 7 billion people. We know that the population is probably going to increase to 9 or 10 billion over this century. Most of that growth is going to end up in cities. That means that cities are going to double. And I'm sorry, this is really small, so you can't see it, but I'll describe what it is. Most of that population is going to end up in cities, all of it effectively, so that the urban population on Earth is going to double in the next 40 years, in the times that a great deal of this audience will still be alive to see that. Because that urban population is going to double, that actually means that the urban built environment is going to double. And how that happens is really fundamentally going to determine how we live with each other, how people live with each other, and how people live with nature on Earth. What we see when we look at these trends is, yes, there are big impacts of that, but this is also, and this was from National Geographic, an increasingly literate population, and an increasingly connected population. And so there are all kinds of opportunities for education, for storytelling, for communicating in a world in which people are very connected. And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to think about as we think about the future of our relationship with nature here in Topanga Canyon, or the LA area, in California, in the United States, or in the world. Thanks.
So we're going to have a short discussion. I have a lot of points to dig into, but I'll keep it brief, and then we'll open it up to everyone for any questions you may have. One thing I really wanted to talk about, or at least kind of put into perspective, is this idea of role model. I think a lot of what we're talking about is Jon Muir as a role model, and to what extent he is or isn't. Jon actually wrote a very eloquent follow-up to the LA Times article, and I just wanted to quote something you had written. Jon Muir was a terrific hero for the 19th and 20th centuries, and he accomplished amazing things in his own life and in the work he has inspired. But while we might take inspiration from Muir as a founder of the environmental movement, we can't count on him for guidance now any more than we can turn back to George Washington as a guide to politics today. So I wonder, you bring up the term hero, and in thinking about it in this perspective, do you think that there's something, are we missing a particular person today? Are we missing a leader?
I think yes, but it might not be the time for that kind of leader or hero anymore. And I think that thinking historically, Jon Muir was very much a man of his times, and there were possibilities for that kind of writing to have real prominence and salience among particularly among the elite in America. That's just really much harder and maybe impossible to do in the kind of cacophonous, diverse world that we live in. So we might really need new ways of thinking about what leadership means.
Yeah, I love that you brought up social media too, and the ways that people are interacting with parks in different ways. Did you have any thoughts, Glenn?
Well, I do want to come back to are we looking for the one great leader? And I think that in many ways that time has passed. I mean, think about this for people of my age. You would eagerly await the next album by, let's say, the Beatles or something, and everybody would know that music, and that would dominate, and they would be the trendsetters and leaders. Look at in music today. Everybody listens to something different. People have a fairly short shelf-life. There's such diversity, in part because we can now stream it, we can download it. It's such a wide playing field, such a huge palette. And I think that's true with thought also. So I think the John Muirs today are found in the leadership of Outdoor Afro, for instance, and some of the Latino movements, and in places like the Sierra Club, where it's individuals trying to make a difference. I'm not sure that they'll ever have that same platform anymore, because everything has become distributed, right? But if we have enough people in these distributed areas that are trying to do good, then we'll achieve something.
I think it does have to do also with that notion of people don't. I think people don't want to be spoon-fed information, and I think that there were possibilities, for a John Muir or others to really kind of speak for people. And that's much more difficult, and maybe that's good in an era in which people want to participate in conversations. They want to be heard. They don't want to be lectured to.
I wonder, we talked in October, we had a man named John Young come and speak, and part of what he talked about was the low membership of organizations like the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society. I wonder what you think the future of organizations like that are. I mean, is everything changing in the sense that people are going to be more engaged in social media rather than being part of the actual organization?
Well, all those are, and I think that was, part of the trouble that I ran into was people interpreted what I said, when I say John Muir may no longer be relevant as saying that the Sierra Club is no longer relevant. And I didn't say that. And I know that, and I knew beforehand, and now I really know because they, they told me, you have to come talk to us. And I went to San Francisco and spent a couple hours talking with, them and learned much more about what they're doing. And I had known much of that already. They're doing a heck of a lot to try and reinvent themselves, to try and figure out how to engage, with diverse Californians, diverse Americans. And part of that is they're desperate to figure out how to connect, how to matter. And I think they're doing a really great job. And it's also causing them to rethink their relationship to communities and not come in to communities and say, we have the answers. We need you to get in line and help us, stop this development or put in, this protected area. But they're going into communities and asking what's important in those communities. And sure, coming in with their basic, environmental goals and values, but understanding that they gotta meet halfway and listen. So, there's a lot of really good, important work, happening in the environmental organizations, as well as in the National Park Service and in California State Parks to figure this out.
I would agree. I think that they really are making a very genuine effort, and they're making a genuine effort to reach into the cities and to redefine nature, including the Sierra Club. Absolutely true. I think when you stand back, there's a larger context here, and that is this fact that people don't want to be spoon-fed. There's many different ideas. They all want to be heard, right? And I think that the dynamics which brings people together in these organizations that have a hierarchy are changing in this country. And I'll give you two examples. The Occupy movement. Occupy movement got a lot of attention, a lot of excitement, but and there was no end game. There was no focus, there was no leadership, and no one's occupying anything anymore. And on the other end of this political spectrum, the Tea Party. The Tea Party was formed, but it eschewed any kind of hierarchy, and it was almost like you were an individual, and that's what defined you as a Tea Party member, or you're libertarian or something. And again, its sway has kind of collapsed. And so I do wonder if there isn't larger context with the grappling with organizations in a landscape where there's so many voices can now be heard and want to be heard. And so I do wonder if there's other deeper things than just the environmental club membership. It's a lot of clubs, a lot of organizations that are losing members, and so I think this is broader.
One of the big focuses of our school is nature connection and making sure that nature is a part of what we're doing, that there's a conscious connection to nature. I wonder, in the past 100 years, in the course of John Muir's legacy, do you think that people have become more out of touch with nature? If so, how do we get back in touch?
So I think that there are reasons for concern, and I think the things like you're doing at the school are really great, and where my concern with it though is that we often measure are people connected to nature. A lot of those studies that say people are less connected to nature are looking at things like membership in these organizations, or visiting national parks, or fishing licenses, or hunting licenses. And I'm not sure that those are the only ways to measure people's connections to nature. What about gardens in the city, or pets even? I talk with a lot of people who have very deep connections to nature through animals, or through gardening, and I think we do know that having a connection to nature and having nature in your life is really important. There's enough studies of that for like health, for cognitive abilities, for feeling good about the world. But we also know that if it might be a little sacrilegious here, like as if you don't, if you can't get out into nature, being able to see nature from a window is pretty darn good. And even being able to see nature on a TV screen can do part of it. Those are. I know you're shaking your head, but there have been studies that have. That have looked at this, and so I'm a little bit like, I think we should really think capaciously about all the ways to think about, to interact with nature. So a friend of mine has a daughter he was going to take her to the aquarium in San Francisco, and she wanted to bring her iPad, and he was like, no, don't bring the iPad. We're going to see nature, leave it home. And she insisted, and they went to the aquarium, and she went through with the iPad, taking pictures, taking notes. And like by the time they were done and they got home, she had posted like a story about their trip to the aquarium, was sharing it with friends. I think that's pretty cool.
All right, so to wrap up, Jon Muir. I'm curious, we've talked about a lot of, benefits and the maybe not so great aspects of his legacy. As the Jon Muir Memorial Chair of Geography, what is his relevance today?
Well, first off, of course, there's just physical things that he left us, the national parks that he left us, and in a sense, an organization which is evolving, the National Park Service, which could do good things in the future and has great people who are well aware. I mean, the numbers I'm quoting, a lot of them come from studies the National Park Service has done. So he left us a physical heritage. Also would say, as the reaction to John's quotes in the article showed, for a lot of people, he's still a very strong emotional motivator for people to care about nature, to care about the wilderness. And I think some of the reaction was because people felt that we were dismissing them. We were dismissing their deep felt care about nature, about what they've put into it. And I think that would be wrong. And I think that we have to have a tent that's big enough for those people that were motivated and love him, that's okay, And that I don't think the intention ever was to sort of say, well, you guys don't matter anymore. And I've gotten that in some of my own writings when I talked about the importance of opening up to the city or opening up to people of color and things like that. It's not saying that people that look like me don't matter or people that really love his writing don't matter. It's just to open it up. So I think it's there. I think the other thing that I find really interesting is Muir was a contradictory person. He had a lot of contradictions. Mm-hmm. And frankly, being an environmentalist today, if you're realistic, it's a world full of contradictions and compromise. Mm-hmm. And I think studying him and getting deeper into that is really interesting territory. And I'm not sure he ever was able to balance those contradictions. I'm not even sure he tried to. But we have to grasp with exactly the same sets of contradictions today. And I think that in the low-hanging fruit, most of it's gone. We're going to be in a world of contradiction and compromise. And kind of thinking about how he dealt with that is, to me, really interesting. And it shows that, the more things change, the more, in a sense, they stay the same. So.
Thank you. So I want to open it up to questions. Liam.
Did what's his name? Jon Muir. Did he ever culturally change the world?
Did he change the world?
Yeah, culturally.
Culturally.
In people's culture, did it change them? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think,
it's a good question.
It's a great question, and I think the most really powerful kind of change that we can't just say that Jon Muir did it. As a historian, I wouldn't, because he was a man of his times, and there were others, like Ralph Waldo Emerson and many others, who were part of the development of a kind of idea of America as nature's nation. That's often used by historians, that what really makes America special are these great open spaces, this wild land, these national parks, these places like Yosemite and Yellowstone, and all the art, the photography and painting that went along with that. And some of the most amazing images of that some of which Glenn showed of big nature in America, came out of photography and painting and the writings of Jon Muir. And so I think he helped shape that idea in our culture that nature is and big nature, big wild places are part of our are part of who we are part of our soul, and so and that's sacred. in a way. And so that's very cultural, right? The idea that nature is sacred is a really strong cultural idea, and Jon Muir had a big part of that.
So in some of Jon Muir's writings, he talks about traveling for days, and he's got a loaf of bread, some tea, a cooking pot, and a blanket. So what that tells me is that he is foraging, he's building fires, he is very deeply understanding and connected and invested in the land. What I see in California today is that there are many people who are visiting the parks that see it as an interesting backdrop to their own human social dynamics. And I question whether these people really deeply care whether we have spotted owls or marbled murrelets, or whether we have a really fully functioning natural system. It's just a nice open space for them to get together and do whatever it is that they do socially. For me, that's really deeply concerning, and I don't know that usage of national parks is a good measure of our society's investment in a healthy natural system. And I'm wondering if either one of you care to speak about that.
I'm going to tackle it head on, and I'm going to say it as follow. Speaking to the writer of the LA Times article, this is a Hispanic guy, we talked about the San Gabriel Mountains and the fact that for a lot of Latino families, they love to go there for exactly that reason. They love to put their feet in the water. They like to have a picnic there. They're not botanizing necessarily or bird watching or anything else, but they really love it. They're really enjoying it. And then if you look at the polling for support for the San Gabriel wilderness area, it's about 88% Hispanics are supported it and were behind it. Now, what they're drawing out of that landscape is maybe different than you and I would draw out of it. I'm not sure I'm going to be in a position to diminish that, what they're drawing out of. And I'm delighted that they are part of the group who supports us creating that wilderness area that we can all enjoy. The other point is this. Remember I said there was some feeling that National Park Service was unfriendly to people of color. Well, that was told to me by this guy. That he was saying, he has colleagues who think that that's inappropriate for them to go have a big family picnic out there and just go out and hang out and all that stuff. And he said that he found that deeply offensive. And that put a barrier between their wanting to be there. They're feeling unwelcome, right? And so, finally, Muir confronted this. Muir wrote to Mrs. Carr in a letter about people coming into Yosemite and, quote, not getting it. They came to hang out, to look. This is back in the day, right? They come and look at it. It's kind of like the Grand Tour, but they didn't quite get it. And at the end of the day, he basically said, yeah, okay, it frustrated him, but it's just the way it was. And it's actually not doing any harm. It's probably doing good. So I get I think that greater, deeper involvement is fantastic. And obviously that motivates me. But I think people take different things out of nature. I would myself never try to free climb El Capitan. Okay? Do you know what I mean? And I would resist if someone said to me, the only way you can enjoy Yosemite is if you're going to free climb El Capitan. I'm delighted that people can do that. I'm respectful and in awe of it. But I think that as long as we're not doing harm and people can come out and enjoy it, some of them are going to get deeper into it. Do you know what I mean? Exposure itself. That's my thought.
Yeah, Glen's right, not only about the San Gabriel Mountains, but about most of the environmental measures and bonds that have been passed in California in the last 10 years have been heavily, it's been due to the disproportionate support for them among Latino voters. And so that's a really important thing to realize. I think the other thing that I would say is that you gotta meet people where they are, and then there's an opportunity, to go to the other kinds of questions, like, important questions that you're asking. And I think that that's also kind of the model for the engagement of a new, younger generation. It may be that they're not joining the Sierra Club or becoming members of the Natural History Museum, so the Natural History Museum is doing First Fridays, where they open up the museum on the first Friday of every month, and they have DJs, and they have food trucks, and they have a bar, and they have science talks, and so you don't immediately ask people to like become, John Muir or Glen MacDonald or Jon Christensen or E.O. Wilson or something, but or to become a member, you figure out ways to have that conversation in new ways and engage and make people feel included, and then you can begin that journey of engagement.
Just as a follow-up on that, though, what about the wilderness paths? Has that really affected I feel that personal frustration of you go up to Ohio and you go up 33 or something, you can't park anywhere because you forgot your paths, right? And so there's this thing where it's like monetized it in such a way you can't, like, Latino families, it's almost like it keeps Latino families out, right?
Yeah, and I think, so the state parks, anyway, is really thinking, and the Parks Forward Commission, which in a couple of weeks when we launch this app is also when they're going to release their final recommendations for rethinking a lot about things like this about state parks, and I think the national parks, will be doing similar. It is, and using technology for that. I mean, so like if you get up there, why can't you pay with a credit card or with your phone even or something? I mean, there's ways of there's ways of lowering the barriers of engagement and making people feel like they're welcome and included. And we really got to begin using all of those ways and pointing and figuring out what are the perceived and actual barriers. Because I think people want to they want to have a connection with nature.
So this is all well and good, but financially, the money that our state parks take in is basically cut in half in Sacramento. So where's the shift on getting money back to the parks? Because if you're going to try to get these people in there, McGrath has been closed off and on. There's one ranger that does 5 parks on Saturday night. So I stopped going to the park.
Yeah, well,
and why is it that every time that there's any kind of budget discussion, the first thing that they're going to put on the block is the parks? Right?
Well, so I would encourage you to watch. I know you're doing it. I know you're doing it, but watch over the next couple of weeks. Okay, there's going to be a new organization created to try to put positive pressure on the California government and state parks at a time when there is real and very, I think, I've looked very carefully at these things. I think there's real possibilities for reform on the kinds of the questions, and concerns that you all are raising, and a lot of that's going to roll out over the next couple of weeks. The key, I think, is state parks went through a crisis. You're alluding, parks were shut down, money was misspent and hidden.
It was misspent because the parks were making money. But the government took half.
I mean, I understand, and I get, and I get all of your saying, and I think one of the basic things that needs to happen is that the parks, the state government and the parks need to show that there's real change, and needs to reestablish trust with Californians, or we're not going to have the support that's needed to do that. And
so what's the organization? Are you sworn to secrecy.
I should let it roll out before I announce it here, but
Your secret's safe.
you'll see it,
No one's up on the internet by tomorrow.
Thank you.
Back here, reflecting on everything that's been shared, and going through a couple areas. One, when you mentioned earlier, the person who, are we looking for a leader? Who, somebody that's going to step up and do everything for us. The feelings that I get is that each and every one of us here, you, me, myself, we're all that person that we're looking up to. So when we get up and we look in the mirror, that's the person that we need to be looking at as the leader. And the word, when I think of community, I think of the word actually common unity. So when what do we all have in common? And we're all unified here, and we all want to share this land, the parks and recreation and so forth. And then I think of, I really feel what you said that you go up and you can't park or you can't use it, or another class of people may say, no, we don't like it because so-and-so. But we all have a common interest, and the land really belongs to us. And I think taking that responsibility, what I find the most offensive is that we continually give our power away to government. And the government has abused their power and taken the money from the people and used it for their own self-interest. But I think that time has come where now we all have to really reflect and say, how much am I giving away? And what are they really doing for me? It's up to us to now care for our land, our parks, and so forth. And you have mentioned something about the money's being able to take care, or the park being closed. Well, why? If there's so many people in certain groups, why aren't they taking the initiative, or we, that individual, taking that initiative to handle that area, or to come together in community to take care of those parks?
That happened a lot when the state threatened to shut down 70 parks. Community organizations around the state sprung up to support those parks and kept 69 of them open. And so I think you're absolutely right that that's essential. It's been part of what's been essential about trying to drive this rethinking of state parks. I think that there's positive direction in that, and that it's going to need the support of organizations and people and groups around the state, and that we'll see that happen. I think one, you've put your finger. These three comments have put your finger on something of a big difference between our times and John Muir's times. It's very concerning to me, that I think we don't believe, or people don't believe that government can be an important part of the solution, and that it should, and that we can, as citizens or voters, that make that government representative of our interests. And I think we have this. I think there's kind of an unfortunate result of that we do have the idea that we all need to solve this individually. And I don't think the big things that are going to be very important, like figuring out a future for our state park system, they're not going to happen without government. So we need to figure out how to make government work for us. And I think at the time, whether you were on John Muir's side or on the opposite side in the debate over Yosemite and Hetch Hetchy, both sides in that debate believed that government could solve this challenge.
Or better service.
Yeah, and it was part of that ideology of what became known as the progressive era, that good government was a big part of the solution for our society. I think it would be great if we could revive some of that. It's a long, hard here, but it's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys very much for coming and sharing your backgrounds and your expertise and your passions. I was just thinking about a few things that were mentioned, and including what my colleague and friend Chris was talking about with respect to what Jon Muir was doing out there when he was by himself, and whether that needs to happen by yourself or not, I think isn't what I'm going at. But you mentioned something about this kid who went to the, I guess it was the aquarium, somewhere with the dad. It was about, dad wanted this nature experience, leave the technology behind, let's get out there and do, and the kid ended up, blogging or writing or Instagramming or, and created something of value that was connected to, and I do agree you can get nature connected looking at these plants that are potted here. One of the things we're really committed to at Manzanita School is actually, and Liam's so sweet over here, he wrote cultural change and he drew the logo, and I don't know where he got that, because that's not something I think he's been,
Our class.
you guys are talking about cultural change. Well, part of what, and you mentioned, I think, Edward Wilson, and it's the quality of attention that I think it starts there. And so I think the father wanting the kid to leave the technology behind is a little bit driven by this sense that recreation in nature is one level of engagement, and it's very important, and it's very meaningful, and it's led a lot of people to give money to the parks. I think what we're facing in the 21st century is a crisis of magnitude that's about some of the values that we hold and some of the ideas. And I think I think what Chris was getting at, Chris Morawski, is that when we do leave behind some of the distraction, we can go into a quality and level of depth with this living, vibrating earth that we are actually born out of, that reawakens our deep commitment to steward this earth. And so the ecological unconscious, maybe it pulls from there in some way, but I think that's a level of conversation and commitment that I think we have to be willing to engage. So not to minimize this incredibly valuable idea that let's harness technology to maybe begin to pull us back in a way that's going to have relevance to kids, but also let's also remind ourselves that there's a quality of attention that needs to be called forth that might require us to turn it off and to study and listen and engage on a level that will bring back a kind of stewardship that's maybe overdue. But and I think Jon Muir and many others like him still are role models in the sense that they really went out with an intention to come back passionate advocates for conservancy. I don't know that I fully agree with the pristine wilderness piece, because I'm more of a tending the earth kind of relation, like Kat Anderson kind of, where we're really supposed to be. And I love that you said, and I'll stop with this, but the city, the parks in the city, the rural areas that were growing food, and the wilderness, they can't be compartmentalized separate entities. They're all the interface between the human and the earth. And we have to be able to traverse those on some common trails, right? That return us to a healthier dynamic. So anyway.
Amen. I think it's one of those, signs of the times that, sometimes when I put it away in my backpack so it wouldn't be buzzing here. It's like when you don't have any signal, it's like, oh, phew. It's like again, or I was hiking with my, but I think it's not always like clear, who's going to make this, connection or this demand. So I was hiking. My younger daughter goes to Middlebury, which is a very kind of eco. There's a lot of she's very outdoorsy and goes hiking and stuff. And so my older daughter and I went to visit her parents' weekend, and she took us on a hike. And both my older daughter and I were like checking my phone. So I was like texting with my partner back here in LA, and she was doing it. And my younger daughter was like, "Put those away!" It's like, "Give them to me. I'm putting them in my backpack. You can't check them." So. No, I don't disagree. I think we can do both. So I don't think it's one or the other. But I think I think it's really important to ask the question that you're asking, and to have these times of disconnecting.
I say it because I watch these students. We have 37 students, right, ages 9 to 15, almost 16, and we don't have self-service up there. It just happens to be up in Old Canyon. But what I really want to say was that I'm watching this experience of kids like mycelium, like they're rooting down into the earth on a level that I can't even articulate. And I'm one that's, I talk a lot, but I see this happening to them, and they're coming back saying things to us, because we do a lot of sort of processing what their experiences are on the land. And we're not just walking out there, we're doing a whole set of nature connection practices, including tracking and wandering and primitive skills and things that awaken kind of DNA in us. And I'm really intrigued with the quality of their connection, okay? And I think it can be quantified, and I think it should be studied and understood, because it's not like anything that I've seen. And they're out there 40 to 50% of the time. They're on the land, and it's a beautiful piece of wild chaparral, and it's connected to MRCA land, and it's endless. I mean, it's an endless, and with this rain that we got, I talk about biodiversity, you know, the Santa Monicas are notorious, and this canyon in particular, and without even knowing, you feel the biodiversity as it's growing up out of the rainy soil. And I wish I could quantify it, because it's fascinating. And these kids, like, they are exceeding our expectations and almost our ability to teach them, because they're so facile with this intuitive place that kind of gets rinsed away by academia and myself. You know,
Well, there's lots of, I mean, there's lots of good studies that, you know, that are quantifying that are corroborating it, you know.
Do you mean like all the Richard Louv stuff, or?
Well, I mean, no, I mean some of, yeah,
I'll have to get
some of the things that, a lot of the things that Richard Louv cites and has built his argument upon, and that continue, you know, and that continue to study and explore things like this. Is where I was saying, you know, that, like, you know, I think it's fairly well proven from my perspective, you know, that nature is good for people, and that, you know, and unfortunately though, it's not evenly distributed, and that, you know, there are communities in Los Angeles that don't have access to nature, even a tree outside the window, and many of those communities, you know, I've done some, you know, studies of the distribution of nature around cities in America, including in Los Angeles. And I think it's clear from looking at that, I mean, to return to the other theme, you know, that those communities are not likely to get nature without some kind of government help, intervention, some policy. And again, you know, where we need, I think, you know, it's just not going to be a solution that can be an individual solution. So I think it's important that we recognize that, you know, nature is not only good for people, it's also a public good that we need to think about. You know, that's so well established that I think it is a matter of health, well-being.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that piece in, because it's easy to be up here in a privileged place and talk about it on this level, and what you're saying is very critical. Like, we need an affirmative action for, that's not a dirty word, but like Caltrans selectively landscapes in wealthier neighborhoods in different ways on the freeways than they do. I mean, it's really, it's interesting and bizarre.
No, I'd just like to say that I think that experience that you talked about, one, that getting that deeper involvement with nature, it's what you were talking about. And I think that's really important. And I also think having those times where all is quiet, in other words, there is nothing distracting you, and you start to contemplate, you know, that's really important too. And I'd like people to have that opportunity, you know, and I think sometimes that will come about when they go there with their friends and they're not even thinking about it, but all of a sudden that moment hits, they get deeper. That's the thing, and that's why I think we probably shouldn't sort of privilege certain activities over others. I think, you know, nature does have a kind of way when you get out there, it does have a way of embracing you, you know, if you just have the opportunity. And I really do agree with John, there's just too many kids that don't have the opportunity. And it's really funny to me too, it's not just, you know, I teach a freshman course at UCLA on biogeography. This has about 130 students in it. You would just be shocked. These are students who got into UCLA. You would be shocked how little experience they have with the mountains of California, with the deserts, with, you know, what's growing between here and the beach. I really, really am just, I'm profoundly shocked by it.
Why is that, you think?
I think there's a number of reasons of it. One is that we live in a huge, geographically, a huge embracing urban, suburban, extra urban space, right? And there's a lot to do there. I think a lot of it is that they drive through these landscapes, but they don't stop at them and they don't contemplate them. I think part of it is that a lot of the kids that get into UCLA are maybe first or second generation immigrant families, that the things that were important were different. It was getting yourself established, keeping your family together, getting an education, all of that. And so the kind of things that my parents made a point of taking us out to parks, and we visited Yosemite and all of that, that may not be the huge priority. Do you know what I mean? Either for lack of resources or it's just not part of the culture. But it really is really interesting to me to see how my career as a teacher, if I talk about Big Bear, or I ask, see how few kids have actually gone and done that sort of thing. Really, really is surprising. And this is an elite school. A lot of the kids are, they maybe not super affluent, but they're certainly not poverty.
So the other thing I teach in addition to history is communications, and so I'm teaching a course on environmental communications, and I have 50 students, and I've divided them into 4 projects that they'll work on developing a communication strategy around water, around parks, around climate, and around backyard habitat. And my charge to them is to help me figure out how to communicate with and engage your generation, because I don't have the answers. I mean, I want to listen to you. Help me figure this out. And one of the students who got most is sort of most passionate about this parks project. She said, I wasn't raised outdoors, it's just a kid like you're talking about. It was we never went, to these places, but I want to do this, I want to get engaged. I want to get other kids, students my age. I really want to figure this out because it's really important. So, that engagement can happen in different ways and at different times in life.
And they got a lot more homework.
Yeah.
And a lot more extracurricular stuff. They're not outside a lot anymore, especially the kids with the 4.2s going to UCLA. They've had to compromise a lot of leisure time to get there too. I think that's a big obstacle.
It's about time to wrap up, but I want to go to one more question in the back.
I just want to comment on the cultural piece. And in traditional Native American cultures, you would have people would be finding themselves as, say, a keeper of a stream, or the steward of a sacred site on a mountain, and even whole groups could find themselves as keepers of certain aspects of the landscape. And as a keeper, that required you to go and sing, say, to the stream, to the spring, to keep it healthy. And you'd listen to see what's out of balance in the stream, because what's out of balance in the stream is out of balance in the culture and in your people. So you listen for that. And I think this kind of deep listening that you're talking about, and helping people have those experiences, those deep experiences, which nature will give us when we can get quiet and when we can get more. The culture that teaches us that's not important. So I do see it as a deep cultural shift that's required, and it is a spiritual shift I see, and that it will happen. The earth will help us get there in one way or another, and but I'm just thankful that everybody's talking about it, and also the access thing. My friend is one of the keepers of Yellowstone. And he talks about not being able to get in there to do ceremony when they need to. So that for the people who are controlling the parks, it's important for them to understand these cultural things.
So that's another really important part of the recommendations for reform of state parks. And there's a Native American, very strong Native American voice on the Parks Forward Commission. And could I just? My thought about that is that there are many different cultural ways of thinking about nature, and of relating with nature, caring about nature, talking about nature, and that, Jon Muir represents one of them. And, an important one in our, in the history of the United States and of conservation and environmentalism, but only one of them. And that one of the things that we need to do is really to begin to ask that question and understand the many different ways that people do culturally think about, relate to, engage, care about nature. And that's really going to help. I think it's really going to help us, and that Los Angeles is a really great place to do that because it's so diverse, dozens of languages, dozens of cultural backgrounds. Can I leave you with one kind of if I have my academic hat on and say there's this idea in anthropology, which I think is kind of is really sort of to just talk about the very diverse ways that people think about nature and culture. It's called multinatural perspectivalism.
Say it again.
Multinatural perspectivalism. And that's the idea, and this is from an anthropologist who's deeply studied indigenous people in the Amazon, and said, that actually what is shared between, all beings is culture, and that nature is what differs. And I mean, a kind of simple way of thinking about this is that for many indigenous peoples, the plants, and animals are other people, and that is covered, by the notion of us, or the people, and it's actually other people who are different. Who are the other. It's not nature who is the other, it's those guys over there who are the other. We're more closely related to the birds and the turtles and the plants and stuff. So I only bring that up as a way of saying, hey, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about, there's a lot of different possibilities for how we think about nature and culture.
Glen MacDonald and Jon Christensen, thank you so much for